Hi, this is Matt, and you're listening to Bluegrass Jam Along, the podcast for anyone and everyone who plays bluegrass. Hey everybody, welcome back. It is Friday, which means it's time for a Food for Thought episode. This one is based on a book that I read recently. Bryan Sutton recommended it to all his guitar students. And I also found out a couple of weeks ago that he bought a copy and gave it to Sierra Hull. So if Bryan Sutton is recommending a book on how to practice to Sierra Hull, you've got to think it's worth a read, right? So what's the book? It is called The Laws of Brainjo, The Art and Science of Moulding a Musical Mind by Josh Turknett. And it's basically a book about practice. How to get good at the banjo, or basically any musical instrument, based on how our brain works. And he's a neuroscientist who's sort of studied the pathways that are created when you learn an instrument and come up with a really effective way to improve that process. And there's some really sort of fascinating takeaways. And one is that you don't need to practice long. He says how you practice matters a whole lot more than how much you practice. And he goes into this in great detail in the book, but there's a separate document that you can download for free, which sort of is a condensed read. I'm going to stick a link to that in the show notes. But one of the things that he talks about in the book and in this document is the idea of visualization. He says thinking about an activity activates the same brain regions as performing that activity. And Bryan Sutton mentioned that he used this visualization process when he was learning the material for Bela Fleck's new album, which, as I'm sure if you've heard it, you'll understand, is remarkably complex in places, and that it really helped him. So I started doing this myself, and it's early days. I don't know how it's going yet. We'll find out. But basically what you do is you picture yourself playing, not watching yourself, but as if you're actually watching your hands on the instrument, placing the notes, plucking the strings, bowing, whatever. And it essentially, as Josh Turknett describes in the book, thinking about an activity activates the same brain regions as performing that activity. And there's a study that he mentions where people were given, piano students were given some music to learn, and those that visualised it learned at the same rate as those who actually sat and practiced it. There's more on that in the book and more on that in the document that I'll share a link to. But I found that fascinating, and I'm really keen to know, do you use visualization techniques, or how do you work out what to practice and how to practice? Because this book's fascinating, and I think it's just a great read for anybody thinking of playing an instrument, because not only is it accessible and readable, it's written about learning a bluegrass instrument, and so much of what is written about how to learn is written about kind of classical music, or, sort of air quotes, more worthy music. And to have somebody who is a scientist who's written a book about playing the banjo, but that is practical and relatable to anybody playing any instrument, I think it's a fascinating thing, and I would love to get him on to talk about it at some point, so I'm going to try and do that. But yeah, that's it really. It's just to introduce the idea of visualization and see who uses it. Does it work for you? Does it not? What have you done with it? And to also just introduce this book if you haven't read it, because I think it's a fascinating one. And with Christmas coming up, stick it on your list and get somebody to buy it for you, or buy it for a friend. Just don't buy one for Sierra Hull, because Bryan Sutton's got one already. Right, that's it for this week. As always, after listening, come along to Bluegrass Jam Along's Facebook and Instagram. There's links in the show notes, and come and tell us what you've been doing and how you practice and what's worked for you. Brilliant, that's it. I will see you next week. Have a great weekend and happy picking. Bluegrass Jam Along is proud to be sponsored by Collings Guitars and Mandolins, making some of the finest guitars and mandolins in the world since the 1970s. Visit collingsguitars.com and find out why.